and he has specialized in energy efficiency. He has a master's degree in environmental engineering. He made a mistake earlier and thought I was from NC State, so I want to get this right. Master's in environmental engineering from the University of Alabama, reputed to be a fine football school. He also has a master's degree from Montana State University. Talk about a change of venue there. In environmental science. And his specialty has been energy efficiency in construction and that sort of thing. Warren practices what he preaches. Among other things, he volunteers in Central America. I have to look at my notes here with the Ecologic Development Fund. He's also been involved with the North Carolina Estuarine Research Reserve. He came to us in the Wilmington area after he retired from working. I think the last job was in the public schools in Warrenton, Virginia, where he helped design and build an energy efficient high school. He and his wife decided to move to Ocean Isle Beach when he retired. I understand you make your wife keep working though, Warren.
Absolutely.
And she is a teacher in the New Hanover County Public Schools. And let's see, Warren keeps busy. He monitors high tide flooding. That's one of the things he's going to talk about. And he made sure that I would tell you that his pictures and other information he's going to present are all his own. And so with that, I'll let Warren start talking. Tell us all about this question of high tide flooding and so forth and so on.
Okay, well, thank you for the introduction, Larry, and thank you, Dana. So Dana, shall I click share screen now?
Yep, you should be able to go ahead and do that, Warren.
Okay, share screen. Let me hopefully get this to the right one. Share. Okay, so now everybody should be able to see a slide that says global climate change, etc. Is that the case?
That is the case. And
okay, wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and start then. If I can get this right, because hold on, I've got to get a little bit more of my screen.
If you click from the beginning over there all the way to the left.
Right. I had to get where I could access. Okay, so we're going to get started. I'm Warren Darrell. This is global climate change in the Wilmington area. So first thing you notice about the Wilmington area, this is the city of Wilmington, we're right about in here, is there's a lot of water. Water is a primary natural feature for us. We have, of course, the Atlantic Ocean. Then you have the intracoastal waterway and all the marshes and channels behind the barrier beaches, Carolina Beach Inlet, Masonboro Inlet, Masons Inlet, and then we have the mighty Cape Fear River, the Northeast Cape Fear River. So water is the dominant feature of our geography here. And the effects of climate change that we're going to look at, we can't look at them all in this brief time. So we're going to limit ourselves to sea level rise and increased hurricane wind speed and rain. And the impacts of those two effects will be land erosion, flooding, and ecological effects. And what I'm going to do is I go through here, when I just show a screen, a lot of times I won't read every word, just read it to yourself, think to yourself. If I ask you a question, you can go ahead and say the answer out loud, even if you're the only one who hears it, but it kind of keeps you going with the presentation. Okay, there's the Earth. So there's a couple things that we would want to know or consider that climate change is of a global spatial scale. In other words, it's big. It's the whole Earth. We're this tiny little speck right here. And climate change involves the Earth's atmosphere, the oceans, the forests, the ice sheets, the grasslands, huge systems. So the causes and effects are both long-term. It's not the kind of thing that changes in a week, a day, or a month. This changes over decades, centuries, and millennia, both in cause and effect. And some of the effects could possibly be irreversible. I mean, irreversible in any kind of time scale that matters to humans. When you consider irreversible over thousands of years or over our ability to consider it and analyze it, that's irreversible as far as we're concerned. Now, global average absolute sea level. So this is global. Sea level is not the same everywhere. It's irregular. So this is the average over the globe. And when we say absolute sea level, that means has nothing to do with land subsidence. Land subsidence is additional to this. This is the level of the sea relative to the center of the earth. And a lot of times you'll see I put my sources down here. Okay, so we can see that the global average sea level has been rising considerably. From 1993 until now, it's been rising at the average rate of 3.3 millimeters per year, which is about 1.3 inches per decade. So even at the current rate, you could see that by the year 2020, by the year, the end of this century, by 2100, we're going to get another foot or so of rise of sea level, even at the current rate. However, it's been accelerating. Again, I put my sources here. This is from NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, federal agency. Prior to the year 1900, the global average sea level was generally stable. Now, of course, if we go back many centuries, it changed with the ice ages and so on. But if we look at the last, century, couple centuries, it was stable prior to 1900. Started climbing. So during this time period, during this 116 years or so, it grew at the rate of 0.7 inches per decade. But now in the last 20, 25 years, it's been going up at 1.3 inches per decade. So you can see that from what we know, the rate of sea level rise is accelerating. We've gone up about 8 inches since the year 1900. So that's enough really to impact even our area, because Wilmington, Wrightsville Beach, they were around in 1900. Now, I'm going to say general consensus. This is the kind of thing that you can't really know exactly. There's a lot of different scientific and scholarly studies, but an average of most of the reliable, real scientific sources predict 2 to 6 additional feet of sea level rise by the year 2100. Now, that's a considerable acceleration from the 1.3 inches per decade. And this is kind of going to be our mantra throughout much of this presentation. So kind of burn that one into your mind as you see some of these photos. Think, what is going to be going on when the ocean is 2 to 6 feet deeper than it is now? Why is the sea level rising? Well, first off is the melting of land-based ice. Now, for instance, Greenland, which has got an ice sheet of about 5,000 feet thick, it's bigger than the state of Alaska. That's a lot of ice. There's additional ice in Arctic islands and in mountain glaciers. This floating ocean ice up here at the North Pole, that doesn't affect the depth of the ocean very much. But when land-based ice melts, it does. The water drains into the ocean. Ocean gets deeper. It's got more water in it. Now, the Antarctic ice sheet, which is even thicker than the Greenland sheet, is several thousand feet thick on the average. And these globes are a little out of scale here in that this is larger than the United States. So there's enough ice here that if it all melted, which it won't in any time scale we can think of, it would raise the ocean. I don't remember the number, but it's where basically a lot of our land would be uninhabitable, like 30 meters or something of sea level rise. But the point is, there's a heck of a lot of land-based ice that can melt. Now, the second reason the oceans are getting deeper is the thermal expansion of seawater, thermal heat. When water gets heated up, it expands. That's why in your home, you probably have an expansion tank for your hot water heater. So when you get cold water goes into your hot water heater after you take a shower, then the water heater heats it up. That water tries to get bigger and exerts force, and it will expand in volume. That's why you have an expansion tank. So those two reasons, as the water gets warmer, it expands, and we're adding more water to the ocean basins. So relative sea level rise is what we see. That's the relation, the relative of sea level to the earth. It's this absolute level, which is all we've been talking about so far, plus land subsidence. Now, in some parts of the world, the land is subsiding. In other parts of the world, the land is rising. This could be tectonic effects. A lot of it is the delayed result of the melting of the ice sheets from the last large ice age glaciation. So we don't have to go too deep into that, but in some places the land is staying still, in some places it's rising, in some places it's falling. So relative sea level rise, which is what can cause flooding, varies depending on where you are. Where in Wilmington, in our area of south of North Carolina, the land is subsiding by about 0.4 inches per decade. That's significant. But remember, the global ocean is rising at 1.3 inches per decade, and the increase in depth of the global ocean is expected to get to be 2 or 3 times that rate. So whereas land subsidence is a factor, it is not the major factor in coastal flooding. Now, the sea level is irregular. Okay, there's our friend the Earth again. The currents, the wind-driven currents, and currents are affected by the salinity and the density of water. That varies all over the Earth. The winds vary all over the Earth. Gravity actually varies over the Earth. You have a gravitational pull of all the ice that's up on the North Pole and down near the South Pole. So the sea level is not the same everywhere, and the impact of sea level rise is not the same everywhere. Okay, this is Wilmington. Now we're getting into it. This is on a day when it is not raining. It had not been raining above on the Cape Fear River. This water did not come because you had a lot of rain upstream in the Cape Fear and it flooded the Wilmington waterfront. This is strictly the result of tide on the 15th of November, 2020, when there was a king tide. Now, a king tide, all that means is that it's a tide when we all know when you have a full moon or a new moon, and a new moon means no moon. You have an exceptionally high tide, exceptionally low tide, and a king tide is when that happens and the moon is at its perigee, meaning that in its orbit, it's very close to the Earth. So then we have exceptionally high tides and exceptionally low tides. So think about it. Wilmington's been here for a few hundred years, since the 1700s. And this happens now more than 5 or 6 times a year, depending on the year. If this were to happen on a regular basis, do you think that the founders of Wilmington would have built the city where it is now, with the waterfront where it is now, which was the reason the city got built in the first place, was the waterfront as a port? This regularly occurs. This is strictly the result of tide, has nothing to do with rain. In 2018, it was a new record, 14 days, and we'll see how much it's been increasing shortly. That's another view of Wilmington, same day. So we can see that's the US course. It affects commerce. It affects all these buildings along the waterfront. Again, this is just the result of the tide in the Cape Fear River. And again, as we had said, keep thinking when you look at these pictures that another 2 to 6 feet of sea level rise. And that will affect the Cape Fear River roughly by that amount, because our tide range near Wilmington up the river is roughly similar to the 4 foot or so normal range that we get out of the ocean here. So I'm going to assume that if the ocean gets 2 feet deeper, our tides will probably also get 2 feet deeper. Now, some of this information, this is about high tide flooding. That's what we're talking about. Again, it comes from our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and that's what we call it, high tide flooding. This is what they say about it. And I happen to sign on to that statement, that I think that just given the general geography, they're looking at this thing over the whole United States, of all our coastal cities, that one of the first, well, we are already seeing serious effects of sea level rise. And so when people say, well, yeah, but it's always flooded, well, that's true. There have always been floods, doubled on the average since 30 years ago. So it's increasing. And this is NOAA's, what they call an inundation event, which I haven't ever been quite able to get the strict definition of that from them. But you can see that the number of flood days per year, according to NOAA, this is in Wilmington, this is at the Wilmington station, has been increasing considerably and steadily since 1940, whereas they had around 1960, couple, 2, 3 a year, maybe on the average, 1980, maybe 5 to 10 a year on the average. Now we're up to over 60 days of flooding at the NOAA station per year. Now, where is that NOAA station? Well, it's right across the river from Cape Fear River Watch. If we were at Cape Fear River Watch offices eating pancakes, as they normally serve on the Saturday seminar, we'd be pretty close to the Waterline Brewing Company. The Army Corps is right across the river, where you'll see at the base of the bridge, you see those tugboats. That's the Army. That's where they're measuring the inundation. And those photos we took were in this section of Water Street near Market Street. And that's roughly the high tide flooding that you see in the city, is from about here, Princess or so, down through this section of Water Street, and then somewhat up Market Street and Dock Street. Okay, it's not all sea level rise. This is dredging in the Cape Fear River. Well, we know the Cape Fear River is a significant shipping artery, so the Army Corps lets out contracts to regularly dredge the river so that it will be deep enough for the ocean-going vessels to make it up to the port of Wilmington. And that dredging does provide more depth and a better, easier path for the ocean water to come upriver the 10 or 12 miles during high tides. So some of the saltwater effects that we've seen, and to a small extent, the high tide effects, some of them are affected by the hand of man by dredging. And that's from this journal. Sea level rise is the main reason for nuisance flooding. Well, we're familiar with hurricanes around here. This is pretty serious. You start getting larger than extreme hurricane surge, and the day will come when, or probably come, when we have an extreme hurricane surge on top of a king tide. So this is Carolina Beach on one of the flood tide days. Now you can see it's raining here, but this has got nothing to do with rain and rivers, because in this part of Carolina Beach, there are no rivers anywhere nearby. That's the boat basin. That's part of the inlet from the ocean. So this is right next to the ocean. There are no rivers to drain here. This water all drains right into the ocean. But what happens here, it's during the king tide, the water falls, and you can see this happening. And when it goes to the storm drains, it's supposed to drain into the boat basin, but the water there is already as high as the street here. So this water has got nowhere to go and it won't drain. Now, the fact is this happens several days a year, rain or no rain. So really the majority of this has got nothing to do with rain. This is high tide flooding. And you can see it's flooding in an important commercial district of Carolina Beach. This is looking the other way up Canal Street. The rain has stopped. Same thing. This is flooding due to it coming in. The boat basin is over here. Water flows in, or it flows up the storm drains, gets to be over a foot deep. They close the road. This happens so frequently now that they've installed motorized automatic gates that come down across the road and tell you that the road is closed. This happens several times a year and restricts access to all of the North Canal Street area of Carolina Beach. The ocean is over here to our right. That boat basin, which is connected to the ocean, is over here to the left. High tide flooding. It's already impeding commerce and will, as it continues, of course, damage infrastructure, possibly building foundations, piping, electrical lines, and so on that are now getting regularly flooded due to saltwater flooding. This is not rain. This is the ocean. Well, this is pretty serious. Now, absent flood management measures, what they're saying is if you don't do anything about it, this is what you'll get. But when we consider the entire United States and the fact that the ocean just keeps on rising, flood management measures can certainly be used to help protect some areas. But it is, in my opinion, and when you look at it, you realize you can't beat this with flood management measures because it's just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse and worse. What do? Do you manage against a 1 foot sea level rise, against a 2 foot rise, against a 6 foot rise, a 10-foot rise? Eventually, you got to get to the cause of the problem. 180 days per year. Now, there are already areas on the East Coast, such as Annapolis, Maryland, Norfolk, Virginia, Miami, that experience more high tide flooding than we do. So this is certainly within the lifetime of our children and our grandchildren. This is going to be a serious issue. It's already seriously impedes commerce and to some degree access to the naval base by employees in Norfolk and to some degree the Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. And it's getting more so. Okay, Curie Beach. This is again during one of those king tides. Now, remember that mantra we're going to think about? So just use your imagination. It's not just where we live and where we work, or this where we work. This is the Port of Wilmington, a major port in southeastern United States. I don't know what the impacts are going to be, but if the ocean gets 6 feet deeper, the tides get 6 feet deeper, at least the peak king tides, it's going to have some impact on this port, which is probably going to require a lot of expensive modification. And this is a major employer in our area. Now, there's another port around here, Sunny Point, on the other side of the river. That is a major national defense, national security installation. So that's going to be affected if the river tides get to be 4, 5, 6 feet deeper than they are now. So we're going to have to do something about that. I mean, this is a major national security installation. When there's a conflict going on overseas, how do you think all the missiles and tanks and everything get over there? They get over there on ships, many of which are loaded here at Sunny Point, which is right down the river from us. Okay, this is Wrightsville Beach. Remember we talked about, there's a lot of water around here. You've got the ocean. This is Banks Channel, Mott's Channel, the Intracoastal Waterway. Look at all these. This has got to be over $1 billion worth of real estate and goes farther up this way. Down Wrightsville Beach goes farther down this way. And then you have the marshes, which are very productive of seafood. Most of the seafood we eat here, those organisms like oysters, crabs, flounder, and others spend at least part of their life cycle in the marsh or the estuary. They are estuarine dependent species, even if they live their adult life in the deep ocean. So when we look at this, let's think about our little mantra again. Just use your imagination. Now, what if we have a king tide? Again, they occur 5 or 6 times a year or more, and at completely random times in terms of season. You know, they don't tend to be this winter or in the summer because of the nature of what causes a king tide. So think about a king tide and a hurricane at the same time. Now, it's not just the built-up environment. This is Masonboro Island, uninhabited. It's a nature preserve, but you could go on it, have to get there by boat, unless you swim. And it's kind of like living almost next to Grand Canyon. It's not as big, but this is a wonderful place. I love going out there. This is a natural area like you almost can't find anymore, completely uninhabited. That's the town of Carolina Beach off in the distance. That's where we saw some of that flooding. And you'll notice that Masonboro Island, this of course, obviously the open Atlantic Ocean, is protected largely by a dune, a natural feature of our barrier islands. The sand builds up, vegetation can grow because the overwash doesn't, the waves usually don't reach that area. And there's a lot of wildlife there, and it protects the marsh back here, which is where we said all those fish and shellfish tend to breed. So this is during a king tide, an exceptionally high tidal event. And this is the south end of Masonboro Island along Carolina Beach Inlet. Well, you can see that it's eroding the inlet. Here's the waves coming in. You could actually even see the waves reflecting off of the bluff, the sand bluff here. Now, this sand has obviously been this deep for decades, excuse me, because look at the size of the trees that are falling into the ocean. Well, this tree had to have been around for 30 years or more to grow to be that size. And it obviously recently eroded. And this happened along a long section of this bluff and continues to happen. You can see, you can sit there. I was in my kayak taking this picture. You can just kind of look, and after a while, you'll see part of the bluff falls down as the waves strike it and erode the sand away from the bottom, and then more and more of these large trees get washed into the ocean. So this is obviously increasing now because these trees wouldn't be there if this was the normal state of affairs. Well, how do we know that the rising ocean accelerates this? Well, no less radical an organization than the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, all the way back in 1984, and their shore protection manuals say this. And these people are strictly about business. They're about getting their job done, which is maintaining navigable waterways like our inlets, Snow's Cut, and the Intracoastal Waterway. So, erosion of our areas, sea level rise. Now we're going to turn to the second effect of that we're going to talk about today of climate change in our area, which is the increasing intensity of hurricanes. But before we do, Dana, are there any questions in chat, or does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask about what we've seen so far?
Nothing in chat right now. Feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask a question for this little question break, anyone?
All right, well, I guess we'll keep going. Now, if you do put a question in chat at the next time, Dana would be able to ask your question or make your comment. So again, this is the National Climate Assessment, which the government does every few years. And this is an assessment put together, you can find this on the internet, by several federal scientific agencies like the Geological Survey and NOAA and the EPA and so on, and academic organizations and the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administrations, which is what they're saying about hurricanes. They're not saying there are going to be more hurricanes. Hurricanes are a very complex phenomena. And so it's not really known how climate change is going to affect them in totality, but it is, again, academically, almost universally agreed that the intensity of hurricanes will increase. And by the way, we're, again, a little speck here, hurricane us. As we know, we kind of live in a hurricane magnet. Hurricane Iota. Didn't strike us that hard, but it hit Central America pretty hard. Okay, now this is Topsail Island right after Hurricane Florence. And again, as we see all this, remember hurricanes and sea level rise, these two things are related in their impact upon us. So you can see Florence got pretty close to taking away this row of houses on Topsail Island. In fact, there were a lot of areas where the walkways down to the beach were just destroyed by Florence. Again, that's from NOAA. There's our mantra again. So you can use your imagination. What's going to happen? Okay, now this is from rain. This is Wilmington after Hurricane Florence. This is not high tide flooding, what we saw before, but it's the same area of Water Street, although it's got more water on it right now. This is from the water flowing down the Cape Fear River that flooded Wilmington right after Hurricane Florence. The hurricane didn't even hit our Outer Banks. Avon's a little north of us, but this is the waves and the storm surge coming in from an offshore hurricane. So as we see, now this has been repaired. So Hatteras, you can drive the Cape Hatteras now. Highway 12 has been repaired, and it's had to have been repaired so many times. There are already some controversy and discussion about who's going to pay for this. But as we see these pictures, we want to be thinking, due to climate change, increased hurricane strength and a deeper ocean to begin with. Okay, this eroded by both probably water and to some degree wind. Both water and wind are significant agents of erosion in our area. So this is part of the dune, the protective dune that protects buildings and the estuary eaten away by Hurricane Florence. Okay, so how do we deal with this? Well, the people that can afford it, the communities that can afford it, they do what they call beach nourishment. Okay, basically you dredge up sand somewhere from the ocean, the intracoastal waterway somewhere, and you pump that sand onto the beach. If it looks disruptive to the environment, it's because it is. And if it looks expensive, it's because it is. In addition to which, as time goes by, if we need to do this more and more to more and more communities, there's going to be a shortage of sand, because there's not that much sand available unless you want to go out deeper and deeper into the ocean. As you do that, the cost will become prohibitive to recover that sand. So this is how we've dealt with it so far. This is why you'll notice there's such a wide beach in Wrightsville Beach, because they can afford to do this. And there is some nourishment that goes on in Carolina Beach and Curie Beach as well. But some of the islands in North Carolina to our north that don't do beach nourishment have seen a very significant erosion of their beaches. In fact, in the Nag's Head, Kill Devil Hills, Kitty Hawk area, there's been buildings lost to the sea as the beaches erode, and they have not been able to, quote, nourish them to keep replenishing them with man, the hand of man, with human construction action. And this, so you want to start thinking, as the ocean rises and rises and rises, how long is this going to be practical, and in how many areas? So, because some people will say, since this works where you're able to do it so far, and we're not able to do it everywhere, as I said, and it works in some places, people say, well, all we need to do is nourish our beaches. But that won't work for downtown Wilmington. There's no beach to nourish. It doesn't work for Annapolis, Maryland. It doesn't work for Norfolk, Virginia. It's a measure that has some impact in some areas. Again, Masonboro Island, the Atlantic Ocean, and again, that tremendously productive estuary that is for sport fishing, for commercial fishing, just for recreation and enjoying yourself. is a, it's one of, I won't say one of a kind because there's other areas in the world, but for us, this is it as far as nature and a place for recreation. Carolina Beach Inlet, where we saw that erosion taking place, that was right in here where we saw that erosion with the waves that were bouncing off the bluffs. This is the Intracoastal Waterway, and there's the Cape Fear River. And by the way, that Army base where we saw the national security installation where they load the ships, that's down here on the Cape Fear River. And probably you'll be thrilled to know that a very short distance, couple miles from that important national security installation, is the Brunswick Nuclear Power Station. And the ocean is getting deeper. Well, Wrightsville Beach is to a large extent along here, as we've seen, protected by the dune. And so that's, a natural phenomena. You can see the rack line here. This is about where the waves got. And then you have the dune above the line where the waves normally get to. Well, after Hurricane Florence, a good part of Masonboro Island, this is called overwash. The ocean, the waves were big enough, the ocean was high enough to knock the dune down. It completely flattened the dune in this part of Masonboro Island. And by the way, these chunks here of black soil are from the marsh, but not from the marsh that we see today. That was when the marsh was out here somewhere where the ocean is today. There's a normal westward progression of most of our barrier islands, including Masonboro. But a question we could ask is, are we accelerating it, and are we accelerating it significantly? So this is after Hurricane Florence. You can actually see the ocean water from the larger waves will come in and keep washing in towards that productive marsh. And this is the result. The sand has washed over and buried a little bit of the marsh. So this is a normal process, but we are accelerating it from sea level rise. And of course, if we get more and stronger hurricanes, especially combined with sea level rise, we're going to see more of this. Now, as it buries part of this productive marsh, the normal progression over geological time has been when the ocean gets deeper, the island migrates westward, but so does the marsh because it inundates more land that is now the mainland and causes more marsh. But what's there now? People, human construction didn't used to be there 100 years ago in geological time. So now, as the ocean gets deeper, as the island migrates westward, what are we going to do? Because all this human construction isn't going to want to just go away. People aren't, they're going to want to build seawalls and armor, which actually they already are, and armor the coastline, which again hurts productivity of marine life. And that's called coastal squeeze. So the islands are still moving in, but if the marsh starts to move in, there's bound to be human resistance. Well, it's not all about the ocean. If we get stronger hurricanes, this was Murrayville after Hurricane Florence. This is all the stuff that got ruined by rain coming in from the houses that had their roofs torn off. And this is Highway 40 after Hurricane Florence. You probably all remember, whether or not you evacuated Wilmington, you couldn't get there. That it was an island. It was cut off for several days due to the residual flooding, and there was no way in and out of the Cape Fear region, or at least the Wilmington part of the Cape Fear region. And so the question to ask yourself is, what's going to happen when the hurricanes get stronger? So we're going to move on to ecological effects. But before we do, does anybody have any questions on what we've seen so far about sea level rise and increased hurricane intensity? Well, I guess I'll take that as a no. So we'll keep on going. Ecological effects. Now, the first one we'll talk about is ghost forests. But when we talk about ecology, it's good to bear in mind that everything is related to everything else, sort of. Not entirely, but to a large extent, the ocean, the atmosphere, the plants, the animals, the soil, people, what people do, these things all affect each other. And there are a lot of times not clear boundaries of exactly what is the effect of something, because everything is part of an interactive system of many parts that are constantly changing. So things are not always as strictly defined as they might be in, when you talk about construction and roads and buildings, where things are strictly defined. Here, the lines are kind of blurry, but this is what's called a ghost forest. Now, when you see a ghost forest, meaning a lot of trees that obviously have been around for a while, these trees have got to be about 20 years old, I would think, but now they're all dead. Well, usually that is due to some disturbance, meaning an unusual event. Now, it could be due to a plague of some kind of insect or disease. It could be due to a one-at-a-time flood, a fire, but it is often due to human action. And what's going on here is ghost forest due to increased saltwater intrusion. Remember, we talked about the ocean getting deeper, and exacerbated by stronger hurricanes, drives more salt water up the Cape Fear River. Well, this is Mott Creek, which flows into the Cape Fear River. We're looking to the east. The ocean's out this way. The Cape Fear River is behind us. If you're looking this way, taking the picture, there's the creek. Excuse me, as that creek becomes more and more saline due to the things we've talked about, it tends to kill the trees. And you can see this all over near Wilmington. As you drive up, go over our bridges, you see very extensive ghost forest areas along the Cape Fear, the Northeast Cape Fear River, down along the smaller tributaries, such as we just saw. And I think it is generally accepted that these ghost forests increased or started happening after the dredging of the Cape Fear River for the shipping channel. But now it appears that they are expanding, and it's not just North Carolina, and it's worse in northern North Carolina, and then it's happening up in New Jersey and all along the Atlantic shore, the Atlantic coast, due to the increased saltwater intrusion into our creeks and our groundwater due to a deeper ocean. And again, just let me reiterate, this is coming from NOAA. So these are not just from allegations or news sources. These are from scientific sources. Now, here's an effect that you don't hear too much about. This looks like a farmer. It's because it is. He's standing in a field where he can no longer raise crops. And this is a little north of us in Pamlico County, North Carolina. What's happened is, as the ocean gets deeper, and we all know coastal North Carolina, it's very low lying, the groundwater is rising. Now, the ocean water is more dense, salt water more dense than fresh water. So the fresh water tends to rest on top of the salt water. But as the salt water rises, it gets closer and closer to the surface, to the extent that some of the salt will migrate or diffuse up through the fresh water, and this becomes saltier. Some of it evaporates, and you have what's called sodification of the soil, which just means that the soil starts to get salty to the extent that you can no longer profitably raise crops. And there was an article you could read in the Washington Post about that. So we can expect to see more ecological impacts, whether it be on agricultural land or wildlands or natural lands, due to sodification of our soil. And where this is going Ecologically, I don't know, and perhaps Larry, being a biologist, might be able to shed some light on this subject. So that's a significant ecological effect. So the North Carolina Climate Risk Assessment Plan. So this put together by agencies of the North Carolina state government says this about ecological effects. Now, ocean acidification, what that is, we all know that we are increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. It's gone up from about 300 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution, actually about 280, up now to about 410 to 420 parts per million of our atmosphere. So the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, its concentration increases. Some of that diffuses into the ocean. And the more there is, the higher the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the faster rate at which it diffuses into the ocean and forms carbonic acid, which is the acid that is in soft drinks like Coca-Cola. That's carbonic acid. When you have carbon dioxide combining with water, it becomes slightly acid. So things, as we know, acids tend to dissolve things, including the shells of shellfish, or they just won't form. So that's what ocean acidification is. That's another effect of climate change, which has an ecological effect. We talked about saltwater intrusion. We haven't talked about this, the ecological effect, the impacts of climate change on disease and disease-carrying organisms is very complicated. So we're not going to go into it, and probably requires a lot more expertise than I have. So one thing that's interesting when we think about ecological effects, we think about the salt water, the ghost forests, the ocean acidification, the salinity being added, salt being added to our soils, is that our natural environment is undergoing multiple stresses, and these things are like all happening at once. So it's not just one thing affects our natural environment. It's many things are interacting to affect it at the same time. And sometimes a certain species or a population or a community might be able to survive one stress or two stresses, but when it has multiple stresses affecting it, and then those stresses affect each other, that can have a additive or worse than additive impact on the natural environment. It's very complicated, but all these things are happening at once. Climate change, it's getting warmer. Some places getting drier, some places getting wetter, some places getting both, wetter in the wet season, drier in the dry season. The sea is rising, as we saw. The ocean is getting more acid. There's healthy coral being affected by ocean acidification. Pollution, plastic, trash pollution, especially plastic, especially in the ocean where it gets ground into zillions of little tiny pieces and then ends up inside the fish and then ends up inside of us. Invasive species, these are Phragmites, not that big a problem yet in North Carolina, problem in some areas, but a European species that had migrated to the New World in the ballast of ships and up around the Chesapeake Bay, and around the Great Lakes. It's a significant ecological problem, tends to form a monoculture and crowd out a lot of the diversity of the birds and the soil-dwelling organisms in marshes. Overexploitation, overfishing, and this is illegal wildlife. It's a stuffed sea turtle. So I'm counting both illegal wildlife trade and over exploitation. It's not just fish, you know, it could be trees. These things, again, they're all happening at once. So here's our friend Wrightsville Beach again. So this impact is the big one, habitat degradation. All this used to be beach or dune. It used to be vegetated. And then in here, a very considerable amount of the marsh has been infilled or been what they call armored. Seawalls and so on have been built to allow construction for humans. So we've lost a very considerable amount of habitat here for animals to survive. Now, there's still a lot left, but again, that's all being affected by these things. So ecological effects, and Larry may have some good comments about this, are very complex, and they're all happening at once. Back to our friends at NOAA. Remember, we talked about long-term effects and irreversible effects. And this is when we talk about what we can do. I'm going to give you an opinion here, that one of the key issues and what we could do and the key problems is that anything we do to reduce human-caused climate change is not going to help us. It's going to help our grandchildren. And let's say we do nothing and things really get bad for them. A lot of hurricanes, a lot of flooding along the coast, billions of dollars of damage, refugees coming from places that have been flooded. Even for them, they'll face the same issue, that anything they do won't help them. It'll help their grandchildren, because these things are very long-term and slow acting. But we're into a very, very big situation. So before we go on to the brief conclusion of this, are there any questions or anything to discuss right now about what we've already seen? Ecological impacts, increased hurricane intensity, sea level rise, and their interaction.
I have quite a few comments and one question into Facebook, but I think we'll wait till the end for this.
Okay, we'll keep going then.
Okay.
Okay, so what have we seen? Sea level rise, increased hurricanes, land erosion, flooding, ecological effects. And again, they're all related, almost everything we saw. And remember that picture of the Earth with the atmosphere and the oceans and the ice caps and the forests and the deserts, the grasslands and cities. It's related. These things all interact. What can we do about it? Well, one thing, if you want to get involved in monitoring king tides, you can go to the North Carolina King Tides Project on the internet and kind of pick a place to monitor tide gauges and or take pictures such as I did. In fact, I wouldn't mind if anybody wants to correspond with me, I can help you get started. I wouldn't mind having somebody adopt Wilmington, because I'm kind of expanding my project to look more up and down the whole North Carolina coast at the impact of king tides. So and I go to Carolina Beach. So anybody who would want to adopt Wilmington, send me an email. I think I've got my address here at the end. And you'll find on this website the North Carolina King Tides calendar. Well, okay, let's just look at the king tide. And again, it's when you get the king tide combined with a lunar perigee, moon is close to the earth, new moon, super full moon, super new moon. So for instance, we just got through a period of pretty high tides and pretty low tides. We probably remember that from this past week. Well, look, we've got king tide events coming here in April. Okay, so on the 26th, what we've got is a super full moon and a lunar perigee, the moon being closest to the earth. So probably it's going to hit the fan, and you will almost certainly get flooding in Wilmington on this period. Now you can see in 2021, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 king tide events. So these things are not that unusual. Now, you might have some years where you have 2 or 3. It varies year to year because you're on different, really completely, whether it's a full moon or a new moon has almost nothing to do with whether it's a lunar perigee or not. So these things come and go at very irregular intervals. But as time goes by, as the ocean gets deeper, even these events now, which are just unusually high or low, but not way higher low like king tide, we'll start to see flooding during them too. So if you want to get involved in monitoring that, you can go to this website or just let me know, send me an email, and I can kind of give you some information. What else can you do? Well, you can have a low energy consumption lifestyle, because we know that the more energy we use, the more carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere. And so use a programmable thermostat, which if there's any one thing that you can do that, some people say, well, don't eat beef. But one thing that people are going to do is get your house going so that the heating and air conditioning is set back when you're not home or at night when you're asleep and you don't really need it. Again, I was in this business for a long time. It saves a lot of energy. Some people, oh, no, it doesn't save energy because you have to heat the house up in the morning. No, it saves a ton of energy. So you can have a low consumption lifestyle. There are marketplace choices. There are some companies, FedEx is electrifying much of their fleet, that are very environmentally conscious, and you can prefer those. You can look for fair trade lumber. You can do marketplace choices that tend to have low impact on the climate. And you can support organizations such as international organizations that help reforest areas or protect the forests in the tropics that will help absorb carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. So you can do your personal things. However, see, now we get to the bad news part. I'm sure some of you recognize this. Chicago. Chicago is the 39th most populous urban area in the United States, in the world. In other words, there's 38 that are more populous than Chicago. The vast majority of the world's population lives like this, and this is a very small part of the Chicago metro area. In other words, doing things in your personal life can have an impact, but we need to do a lot more than that. Because no matter what you do to raise your own food or whatever you do, that's all good, but it's not going to affect most of the Earth's population and all the concrete and steel and transportation and electricity that go into our urban areas, from Mexico City to Shanghai, China, to Chicago, to Los Angeles, to London, to Berlin, to Sao Paulo, Brazil. We have to do something about world. Now this is okay. Now we're into opinion land here. So this is my opinion. A lot of what I've told you is scientifically backed up. Now I'm giving you my viewpoint. We have to do more than our own personal lifestyle. Well, get involved. Help make public policy. I'm not taking a position here. Cape Fear River Watch is a 501c3, I believe it is. They can't take specific political party positions or candidate positions, but get involved, because it's big national and international policy that's going to make the difference. And there is my email address, and you can look at me on Facebook. So if you want to correspond or get a copy of this presentation on PDF, you can. There's a couple little turtles making their way into the Atlantic Ocean on Masonboro Island. So that concludes the presentation. So I think it's discussion time.
Thank you so much, Warren. That was amazing. Can you unshare your screen just so we can get back to humans if the folks want to show their face and unmute?
Okay, are we back to humans?
Back to humans. Let me fix this view for our recording. Okay, feel free to show your face, folks, during discussion time. It's always better to see each other during COVID. I do have one question from Facebook. First of all, great presentation. Thank you so much for all that information. The question from Facebook, okay. What is New Hanover County doing to address climate change?
The answer is I don't know. I'm not that involved with our local level, I could tell you a couple things. There is a Wilmington chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is also a nonpartisan group. Citizens Climate Lobby, they are politically active and encouraging legislation to get to the root cause of climate change. Specifically, their purpose is promoting what was called the Carbon Fee and Dividend Act. In other words, putting a price on carbon. So if you want to be involved in I think a good organization that is politically involved, it would be Citizens Climate Lobby. Other than that, I know there are some measures going on, like they keep hitting it back and forth and they haven't done anything yet. Carolina Beach wants to take measures to try to help wall off, let's say, that high tide flooding, which, as I said, I believe is a temporary small scale measure. But, you know, from their point of view, they got to try to do what they can do today. So there are some, some of the localities are looking at what can we do to mitigate effects on our own personal, our own area. But in terms of large scale, I would say probably Citizens Climate Lobby, and I'm sure there are others. And even what we talked about, the interaction of the world, the ecology of natural systems, when you do some of the things, for instance, the Cape Fear River Watch encourages, conservation of the ecosystems along our coast and along our rivers, you are then helping to mitigate climate change, because those natural systems, the marshes and our forests, they absorb carbon from the atmosphere and help mitigate the buildup. So these things are all related, and to a large extent, when you conserve nature one way, you're helping it in other ways. I wouldn't say it's universally always 100%. So I would say supporting your NGO organizations like Cape Fear River Watch and others. Politically, you could get into Citizens Climate Lobby. Beyond that, I don't know that much about what we're doing locally.
Well, we do have some folks on who may know a little bit more. Is there anyone else who wants to take a stab at what the county is doing? Okay, well, I will share, the state, we know that Governor Cooper signed Executive Order 80, which does limit greenhouse gases, sets a reduction of 40% by 2025. So it's my understanding that the municipalities are, in line to try to achieve that goal. I know the city of Wilmington did sign a resolution to that effect. I think the county has not yet. But again, feel free to reach out to your county commissioners and suggest that they do so. And there is another question in the chat. Understand saltwater infiltration, but please explain how river dredging affects flooding.
Okay, it is actually, okay, for a more thorough explanation, you would go back to that reference that I showed from that civil engineering journal that I showed in the presentation. But the shorter version is that if you picture the Cape Fear River and the ocean, its mouth at the ocean down there by Southport, about, I think it's 10 or 12 miles south of Wilmington, when the tide in the ocean rises, the water level in the Cape Fear rises and kind of like a wave moves up the river to Wilmington. But now if you dig a deeper channel in the river, now I admit it, you're going down, not up, but still now the heavy, and remember the salt water tends to flow below the fresh water because it's heavier than fresh water, it's more dense, that you have now got a bigger channel for that water to flow up. Picture it like a pipe. Say it was a pipe running from the ocean to Wilmington. Well, if you had a pipe that was, let's say, 4 inches across, but now you dredge it and it's the equivalent of a pipe that's 6 inches across, you have a bigger pipe. You have a bigger channel. So more water makes it up that bigger channel because it has a bigger path to flow in. So that is how it affects, that's one way that it affects the tides in the Cape Fear River. And you'd have to look at that study to see, in some places, other effects are when people build seawalls, what they do is then, as the water comes up the river, instead of spreading out laterally over the marshes, now somebody's built a house there. Remember, we saw the pictures of those houses right on the edge of the Intracoastal Waterway. If they build seawalls along bulkheads, along the river, along the waterways, then that water can't spread out laterally, so it tends to keep moving upriver. So it's those two things, the deeper channel and then the armoring, hardening of the banks of the channel tend to force or allow more water to flow upriver.
Larry, did you want to, while we're on this topic, share your commentary about the soil effect?
Yeah, one of the insidious effects of saltwater intrusion inland is that seawater contains sulfate ion, which can be used by anaerobic bacteria as a source of atomic oxygen for their metabolic activities. And it allows them to metabolize the organic constituents of marshy soils, so organic rich soils. So in addition to the intrusion of salt water, which has direct effects on vegetation, it also causes the land itself to be decomposed and to sink. And that's happening particularly up in Dare and Hyde counties. The land surface is actually subsiding because of the decomposition of the organic soils there, in addition to sea level coming up. So they get a double whammy effect. We see a little bit of that here in this Cape Fear River basin, but we don't have the kinds of organic soils as widely distributed as you do down east. So there's some of that effect as well, but most folks aren't aware of that, and they don't realize that you let salt water into what used to be a freshwater system, and you're going to decompose that soil.
That is interesting. I like that.
We don't like that, Warren. Wrong answer.
No, we don't like that.
No, well, I mean, I like to learn that.
Right. The land is sinking while the sea is rising.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Got quite a few folks on here. Feel free to unmute yourself. We'll leave a few seconds here for space.
Yeah, I would encourage people to ask a question or make a comment, because this is your chance. We got a great group here. Once we break up, you won't get a chance again.
I'll throw out a comment. I watched a movie last night called Kiss the Ground. If you haven't seen it, it's on Netflix. And it's was new to me, but I'm not a scientist, and I was pretty impressed. It was all about soil and farming. So if you're looking for something to watch, and all about those microbes that Larry's talking about, you know, you might want to watch it.
Definitely recommend, and it's kid friendly. It's understandable by all.
Yeah,
kid friendly, and those of us without, you know, as bio brains as Larry and such. Thank you, Paige. Good to see you.
Yeah, let me comment on that. I'm glad, Paige, that you brought that up, because we all think of, and you hear in the news, well, what are we going to do about climate change? We got to go to carbon-free energy, wind and solar, and probably nuclear, much as people hate that. That's all true. But in addition to that, an almost equally big part is how we manage our land. That agriculture and wildland, forests, and our marshes and what they call blue carbon on our coast are just as much a part of the solution as managing our energy systems, because we want to prevent those biological systems from emitting carbon into the atmosphere, for instance, when a forest burns or when a soil is oxidized. And we want to manage them so they absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so what you just talked about, Paige, with managing our land and our agriculture is just as important as managing our energy systems. And in response to an earlier question about what people are doing around here, all the organizations that help preserve our coast that help preserve our marshlands, that help preserve our oyster beds, are part of the solution, because those natural systems, when we preserve them, absorb carbon from the atmosphere and lock it up in the soil or in vegetation that gets buried and becomes part of the soil. And so those systems are also important.
Definitely. It's there's so much involved, and I would like to point out the plastics issue that you briefly mentioned, Warren, in your presentation. Cape River Watch is getting more involved in plastics. We're doing a research project with Waterkeepers Carolina and Plastic Ocean Project. But you know, the oil industry now, knowing that oil and gas is becoming less and less bought, and in less and less countries and folks are interested in it, are pushing plastics because plastic is made from oil. So that, you know, talking about the cyclical issues of climate change, if you reduce your plastic consumption, you're actually helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well. There's so much involved, you know, reducing your purchasing from Amazon, reducing, you know, the traffic overseas on these big container ships. You know, all of these things, every single thing that we do really, I think, has an impact. So here's a question from the chat. Electric vehicles are expanding. How will electric power generation needed to charge these vehicles affect climate change?
That depends on how we do it. The short answer is that going to electrifying transportation to the extent that we can will reduce greenhouse gas emissions if we generate our electricity in ways that do not emit greenhouse gases. So if we're able to decarbonize our electrical grid, meaning phase out coal and natural gas power plants and replace them with solar, with non-carbon emitting sources such as solar, wind, geothermal, and possibly nuclear, that will have a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. It's not the only thing that we have to do, but if we concurrently decarbonize the grid, going to electric transportation is a big part of the solution.
Thank you. And Sue, good to see you. I see you have your hand raised. Did you want to make a comment or a question?
I just put it in chat. I know that New Hanover County has appointed a resilience manager in response to that report from the governor's report on climate change. I'm not sure what has come of that, but at least it's a good sign that they've appointed somebody in charge of it.
Mhm.
Yes, I think that is a good sign.
I have a question. Clearly there's a huge amount of activity in trying to reduce, change public policy, change our economy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts of that. But we are already on a trajectory that will, no matter what we do, is going to have intermediate and even long-term impacts. So what should we be doing? What could we be doing to creatively adapt to the changes that are happening in a constructive way?
Bill, that's a good question that
Where do you start?
is not what I have specialized in focusing my efforts on, is adapting to the inevitable. I have focused my efforts on trying to get to the root cause, but I agree with you 100%. No matter how much we get to the root cause, we're going to suffer some of the effects no matter what. And I think it's going to be very difficult, depending on how it goes. As the seas rise, what are you going to do? To some extent, you can defend your cities and you can defend your infrastructure with, seawalls and so on. Pumping stations, but to some extent, you might just have to move back and get away from the coast. It's going to be, I think, the adaptation I'm not enough of an expert on it, but I think it's going to be very expensive. We're always going to be one step behind what we need to do because people tend to react after something bad happens and not before. And we're in a case now where it's kind of like a person who smokes. And if you wait until the doctor tells you you have a tumor on your lung before you quit smoking, you can quit smoking, but it's too late. And I think we're in a situation where the danger of that is somewhat similar. So, Bill, I'd encourage you to look into that whole, generally speaking, people kind of use the words mitigation for preventing climate change or slowing it down, and adaptation for the kind of things you're talking about. What do we do now to deal with the inevitable? And you might want to research that because I haven't done that much on it, and I'm not that hopeful that there's a lot that we can do.
Yeah, I was just thinking that there are ways that we can adapt. You're trying to hold back the inevitable, try to hold back the wind. And then there are ways that we can adapt that probably reduce the rate of change in a way that is more constructive, more in line with trying to reduce the root causes as well. And I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. If we just react reactively to bad things that are happening, then we're probably going to do, it's like having to have major surgery to deal with your lung cancer, right? But
Right.
if you acknowledge that, your body is declining or changing because of your smoking habit or because of your age even, then you can prevent perhaps having to have major surgery and do other things that still deal with the problem, but don't have the terrible impact on your body or on the ecosystem in our case that some of the really reactive changes might be. And I haven't really given any thought to it. Just the thought came to mind as we were talking about this, that, some of this is inevitable and how we react to it.
I did have a discussion with one of our representative. Well, I can't get too specific. Did have a discussion with the aides of one of our elected representatives. And my impression, and well, not just impression, what they said, they talked about adaptation. They didn't say anything about root cause. And the adaptations they were talking about were things like more beach nourishment, building seawalls, adding pumping stations. And these are specific measures that will help one specific place for a limited period of time, and by no means are the kind of adaptations that you are suggesting where we have to adapt in a big way. Like, how do you deal with the entire North Carolina coast, not even counting the whole United States or the world? But in terms of root causes, I would say the single most important thing that society can do for root cause would be the various things proposed under what you hear the phrase, quote, carbon tax, whether it be the Carbon Fee and Dividend Act, but a way in which fossil fuel pollution, in a way in which carbon pollution costs money, but then you give all the money back to people. And that would be, and having worked in that for my career in those fields, that is by far, in my opinion, the single most important thing we can do. It encourages both energy efficiency and non-carbon emitting energy. And it also uses the creative power of our free market rather than government dictates, because you can't police the energy system to get rid of. It's too big, it's too complex. But if all our business people and engineers and scientists are working on it because it's profitable, that to me is by far the single most important thing we can do. Is whether you call it a carbon tax, the Carbon Fee and Dividend Act, some version of charging money. If you want to pollute, you're going to have to pay for it, because then people are going to figure out how not to pollute, because if you don't, your competitor will.
Warren, there is another comment in the Facebook, and I think we'll probably make this our last point of discussion because it's nearing 10:30. This comment is I'm just going to read it. How about overpopulation in the Cape Fear area? I lived down below Leland from 1995 until 2016. When I moved, it was all country, and now it's all neighborhoods. They have already ruined many wild areas. From my activist point of view, I just want to say before I put this out for discussion, agreed, obviously this area is extremely popular. I think we're #1 right now in the country for new movers. The population growth is expected to get even more so by 2050. And so I would suggest people make sure that they contact their county representatives, their state representatives, their city representatives. And as Warren had said, vote. We need to get some folks in there in these positions of power who don't work for the real estate industry and who don't work in development. And this is important. And so, that we have seen our traffic situation go crazy. We have seen our trees being destroyed, and we have seen, countless new self-storage buildings over just in the past 3 years, all along College Road. And so I would implore you all to just take a couple minutes, once a week to call your leaders and tell them, this is not what you want for Wilmington. This is not why you moved here. And then I will push that over to Warren, our amazing speaker, for his thoughts. Warren, you're up.
Does anybody have anything more they'd like to comment on or discuss? I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here. Double thanks to Dana and Larry for your help. Can't do it without you. Again, if you're interested in getting a copy of this, you can send me an email that I had posted on the presentation. If you missed all that, probably Dana can get it to you or get me your request. So does anybody have any further comments?
Okay, well, thank you so much, Warren. And again, I will be, after this this session ends, the Zoom recording will be saved to our YouTube page. I will send that, our communications manager will send that this Wednesday in our email. Please get on our email list. And thank you again, Warren, and as well, all of the folks who have joined and made this conversation really meaningful. Have a great Easter weekend, everyone.
Thanks again, Dana and Larry.
Bye.